My employer, a millionaire elderly man, paid me in jewelry and money to keep a secret from his wife. The sound of the old clock in the living room filled the mansion with a heavy presence, as if time was waiting for something to happen. The persistent ticking echoed off the marble walls, reverberating down the empty hallway that led to the kitchen. There, Hamilton Lockwood, the respectable millionaire everyone knew as a pillar of society, sat in his leather chair. His eyes, which had seen the heights of success and the decline of time, now watched the kitchen door with an intensity that revealed a dark, almost desperate desire. He knew that at any moment Ruth, the young maid he had hired just a few months ago, would walk into that room. He was used to controlling everything: business, finances, people. But the pulse he felt now, something deep and almost uncontrollable, was different. It wasn't a matter of power or control. It was something more primal, a desire that had silently grown inside him and now consumed him. Ruth, with her simple ways and shy smile, was everything that Mary, his wife, had never been. Unlike his wife's calculated coldness, Ruth was warm, and there was a kindness in her gestures that unsettled Hamilton. It was more than just attraction. He wanted something from her that went beyond the physical, something he couldn't name, but that had left him obsessed. When the kitchen door opened, the air seemed to stop. Ruth entered, dressed in her modest uniform, her brown hair tied up in a messy bun. She didn't look directly at him, just carried on with her tasks. But Hamilton could no longer ignore the desire consuming him. This was the night. He knew it. There was no turning back. Ruth, Hamilton's voice broke the silence, low but loaded with an unexpected urgency. Ruth froze. Her heart immediately raced. Something in Hamilton's voice made her stop, something she had never heard before. She slowly turned, her eyes trying to understand what was happening. He was different. There was a tension on his face, an anxiety she didn't recognize. "Sir?" Her voice came out shaky, as if she already knew this conversation wouldn't be like the others. There was a darkness in the air she couldn't identify, but she could feel it. Hamilton stood up, the weight of his words seeming heavier than his legs could bear. He walked toward Ruth, stopping just a few steps away. Her eyes followed him, nervous, confused. And then he let it out. "I want you to keep something secret, Ruth. Something between us. And I'm willing to reward you generously." His words hung in the air, heavy, dirty. Ruth's eyes widened, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. What was Hamilton insinuating? I don't understand, sir." She tried to stay composed, but her voice betrayed her growing fear. Hamilton took a step forward, the tension between them almost tangible. He reached out and gently grasped her wrist, but his firmness left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "I want you to be with me, and I want no one, especially Mary, to know. Money, jewelry, whatever you need. In exchange, your silence." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Ruth's feet. She had always known that working in that mansion would be difficult, that life there would require sacrifices. But this was a nightmare. She felt trapped, like a cornered animal. Her mind raced in 1,000 directions as she tried to process what was being offered, or rather imposed. "Mr. Hamilton, this isn't right." She finally managed to murmur, pulling her hand back, feeling the urgency to escape that room. But Hamilton's gaze held her in place. "I can't do this." He shook his head, as if dealing with a child who didn't understand the rules of a game he had already won. "I know it seems hard now, but you'll realize it's best for everyone. You'll be well taken care of, Ruth. No one needs to know, not even Mary." Mary. The name echoed in Ruth's mind. Hamilton's wife, always so kind and trustworthy, a woman who treated Ruth like family. How could she betray Mary like that? But at the same time, how could she escape the offer Hamilton was making? He was the most powerful man she had ever known. Refusing could mean losing not just her job, but perhaps much more. A heavy silence fell over the room as Ruth faced her dilemma. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and confusion. How could she escape this situation without losing her soul? She looked into Hamilton's eyes, trying to find some trace of the man she thought she knew. But all she saw was the darkness of a dangerous desire. "I need to think," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. But deep down, she knew thinking wouldn't change what was coming. She was trapped in a web of power and manipulation, and the way out didn't seem clear. Hamilton nodded slowly, as if he knew Ruth's response was just a formality. "Take all the time you need. But remember, Ruth, some opportunities are one of a kind, and I can guarantee you'll never have another like this." Ruth left the room, feeling the weight of Hamilton's gaze on her back like a shadow that wouldn't let her go. The mansion, once so grand and secure, now felt like a suffocating labyrinth. Each step she took seemed to sink her deeper into the quicksand of that terrible secret. And in the distance, Mary, unaware of everything, rested in her room. The silence of the night was as treacherous as her husband's words, and Ruth knew that what was to come would change their lives forever. Before you continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. Can I count on your help? Thank you from the bottom of my heart. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the small house Ruth called home. Outside, the city began its usual routine, but inside Ruth's heart, chaos was just beginning. The image of Hamilton and his words, offered with a calculated coldness, wouldn't leave her mind. "Jewelry, money, you'll be well taken care of." She tried to push the thought away, but reality was harsh. Ruth was a single mother, and every day she carried the weight of responsibility for her 5-year-old daughter, Emma. The apartment they lived in was small, with damp and faded walls, but it was the best she could afford with the wages she earned. Emma slept soundly on the worn-out couch, her old blanket rising and falling with her soft breaths. Ruth watched her daughter, her heart heavy with love and fear. Every day, she sacrificed for that little girl, doing the impossible to ensure Emma had the bare minimum of comfort and security. But the truth was, a maid's salary would never be enough to provide the life her daughter deserved. That morning, Ruth left the house with a heavy mind. The walk to Hamilton's mansion seemed longer than ever. Each step echoed her doubts, and her conscience weighed like an anchor, dragging her into a sea of guilt. When she arrived at the grand wooden door, she was greeted by the housekeeper, who directed her straight to the living room. Upon entering, there was Hamilton, sitting with his usual imposing posture, but this time, there was something more. In his hands, he held a velvet box. "Ruth," he called softly, his eyes fixed on her as he extended the box toward her. "I thought of you." She froze in place, her eyes locking onto that box. What was he doing now? It was clear he hadn't forgotten about their conversation the night before, and this gesture seemed like a cruel reminder of what was at stake. With hesitant hands, she opened the box, revealing a solid gold bracelet encrusted with small, sparkling stones that captured the light in an almost magical way. Ruth had never seen something so luxurious up close. The stones seemed to twinkle like stars, and the gold shimmered with a mesmerizing glow. "It's for you, Ruth." Hamilton's voice broke the silence. "A small gift, a sign of what's to come, if you accept." She looked at the bracelet, her stomach tight with anxiety and desire. For a brief moment, she imagined herself wearing it, walking the streets with her head held high, without the crushing weight of poverty. It was a glimpse of a life she had always dreamed of, but never believed possible. But then, Emma's voice echoed in her mind, calling her mommy, and reality came crashing back with all its force. I don't know if I can, Mr. Hamilton," Ruth said, her voice breaking with confusion. "This is too much, it's wrong." Hamilton slowly approached, never taking his eyes off her. "There's nothing wrong with taking care of your family, Ruth. Think of your daughter. Think of what this money can do for her. Imagine the education she could have, the opportunities. A bracelet like this is just the beginning. You'll have everything you need." Ruth felt a wave of panic surge through her body. He knew about her daughter. He was playing on her greatest weakness, and she hated how much it affected her. Hamilton was right. She dreamed of a better life for Emma. A life where her daughter wouldn't have to wear secondhand clothes, where she wouldn't have to sleep on an old couch and eat the bare minimum Ruth could afford with her wages. But at what cost? The dilemma was crushing. Why did everything in her life have to be so hard? Ruth ran her hand over her face, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She was a desperate mother, and desperation made people do things they wouldn't otherwise. The weight of the decision was unbearable, and Hamilton knew it. He knew exactly where to push, and the bracelet in her hands was proof that he wouldn't give up easily. Later that night, Ruth walked home, the cold of the early morning wrapping around her, but it was nothing compared to the cold she felt inside. The bracelet was hidden in her bag. She hadn't been able to give it back. How could she? Part of her was enchanted by the luxury she had never had. Part of her was already starting to give in. When she entered her small apartment, she found Emma still awake, playing with her dolls on the living room floor. "Mommy!" Emma shouted joyfully, running to hug her. Ruth picked her daughter up in her arms, feeling the warmth of her little body, and all she wanted was to protect that little girl from all the suffering in the world. But how could she protect her if she herself was being pulled into a whirlwind of desperation? "Are you hungry, my love?" Ruth asked, her voice almost breaking. Emma shook her head, not noticing the tension her mother carried. "I played all day. I wished you were here, Mommy." Ruth smiled, but her heart was in pieces. She sat with Emma on the couch, holding her close, as the dilemma grew even bigger in her mind. She knew what Hamilton was offering. She knew she could guarantee Emma a life she could never provide on her own, but it would cost her integrity, her peace. How could she live with that? As she looked at her daughter, Emma's tiny hand holding hers, the desire to protect her grew even stronger. Ruth needed to do something to give her daughter a better life, but at the same time, every part of her soul screamed against Hamilton's proposal. The dilemma was far from over. She looked at the bracelet once more, hidden at the bottom of her bag. The gold gleamed under the faint light of the room, like a silent temptation. She knew that bracelet represented much more than just a piece of luxury. It was the key to a life of privilege, but also to an invisible prison. Ruth wondered, how far was she willing to go for her daughter? How much was she willing to sacrifice of herself to secure Emma's future? The silence of the night seemed to close in around them as the decision hovered, heavy and inevitable. Ruth knew that, one way or another, her life would never be the same again. The next morning, the Lockwood mansion was quieter than usual. The cloudy sky cast a gray light over the antique furniture and heavy curtains, as if even the weather knew about the secret looming within. As usual, Ruth arrived early for work, but something inside her had changed. The weight of the gold bracelet, now absent from her bag, left her heart feeling lighter, but also more divided. As she crossed the entrance hall, she was greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Atkins, a stern and observant woman who always seemed to notice what others preferred to hide. Ruth, however, kept her head down, focused on her duties. "Good morning, Ruth," Mrs. Atkins said, but there was a hint of suspicion in her voice. Her ever-watchful eyes lingered on Ruth a moment longer than usual. "You seem tired. Is something wrong?" Ruth startled internally, but kept her composure. Mrs. Atkins was known for her discretion, but also for being the silent shadow who saw everything in the mansion. Nothing escaped that woman's notice. "No, Mrs. Atkins, just a sleepless night. My daughter is going through a tough phase with her sleep," Ruth replied, offering a polite but tense smile. It was the first time she had felt afraid that someone might discover what had happened with Hamilton. She knew that if Mrs. Atkins suspected something, it could quickly spread through the house. The housekeeper seemed to accept the answer with a slight nod, but her eyes still followed Ruth as she passed. The tension, though subtle, still hung in the air. But then, something unexpected lifted Ruth's heart. "Oh, you didn't know? Mr. Lockwood left early this morning. An important meeting out of town," Mrs. Atkins informed her casually, turning back to her list of chores. Ruth felt a wave of relief wash over her. Hamilton wouldn't be there that day. For a brief moment, she felt free. Free from his heavy gaze. from the words loaded with hidden intentions. She could breathe. With Hamilton out of the house, Ruth allowed herself to work with more ease. Time seemed to pass faster, and Mrs. Atkins' curious eyes gradually shifted their attention to other matters. When the clock struck 3 in the afternoon, Ruth said her goodbyes and walked through the city with a specific destination in mind. She stopped in front of a modest jewelry store with a simple display but an air of exclusivity. The jeweler, an older man with round glasses, greeted her with a nod as she entered. Ruth's heart raced as she pulled the bracelet from her bag and placed it on the counter. I wanted to know how much it's worth, she said, trying to control her anxiety. It wasn't every day a bracelet like that passed through her hands. The jeweler carefully took it, examining the gold and stones with the experienced eye of someone who had done this for years. After a long silence, the man gave his verdict. It's a valuable piece, miss. High-quality gold, and these stones are authentic. Do you want to sell it? Ruth hesitated for a moment. She knew that bracelet represented much more than just money. It was a symbol of something dark, of an implicit agreement that could destroy her peace forever. And yet, when she thought of Emma, her decision became clear. Yes, I want to sell it, she replied, her voice firm despite the inner tremor. The transaction was quick. When Ruth left the jewelry store, she felt lighter, as if she had rid herself of a weight that had been crushing her for days. With the money in hand, she paid off all her debts. The overdue rent, the bills that had been piling up, and there was still a considerable amount left over. Before heading home, Ruth stopped by a toy store that her daughter loved to look at through the window. Emma had always dreamed of a doll that seemed as out of reach as the happiness Ruth struggled to provide. But now, for the first time, Ruth could make that dream come true. She entered the store, tears in her eyes, and chose the doll. It was beautiful, with long brown hair and a pink satin dress. When Ruth got home that night, Emma ran to her, eyes sparkling with anticipation as she always did when she heard the sound of the key in the door. Ruth was exhausted, but something inside her urged her to keep smiling. She wanted to see that moment, that instant when she could finally make her daughter happy. "Close your eyes," Ruth said, barely able to contain her own emotion. Emma giggled softly as she obeyed, trying to guess what her mother was preparing. Ruth then placed the doll in her daughter's small arms. "You can open them now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. When Emma opened her eyes and saw the doll, time seemed to stop. A huge smile spread across her face, her eyes wide with pure joy. "Mommy, it's her. It's the doll. I can't believe it." Ruth watched her daughter's reaction, and at that moment, the tears she had been holding back finally fell. She had done it. For the first time in a long while, she had given Emma something that didn't come from sacrifice, but from love, from generosity. And that made all the suffering worth it. But as she watched Emma play with the doll, a shadow of doubt crept into her heart. Her daughter's happiness was undeniable, but at what price would that happiness come if she accepted Hamilton's offer? Ruth thought about how that money could transform their lives permanently. Not just a doll, but a better home, a quality education for Emma, a life of comfort, free from the crushing poverty. The dilemma still loomed. Hamilton had promised more than a bracelet. He had promised a lifetime of financial security. But that would mean sacrificing something she wasn't sure she could ever get back: her dignity. The next morning, Ruth woke up with a sense of relief. Emma slept peacefully beside her, the doll carefully nestled in her arms. Seeing her daughter's happiness gave Ruth strength, and for the first time in days, she felt less trapped by fear. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out of the situation without losing herself in the process. When she arrived at the Lockwood mansion for another day of work, her heart was a little lighter. Hamilton had not yet returned from his trip, and his absence gave Ruth the peace of mind she needed to think more clearly. She knew the bracelet had only been the beginning, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a way to protect herself and her daughter without fully giving in to Hamilton's dark desire. As she tidied the rooms, her mind still torn between Emma's well-being and the difficult choices ahead, Ruth knew that soon, she would have to make a final decision. Hamilton's time was running out, and so was hers. The calm days that followed Hamilton's trip provided Ruth with a brief but deceptive respite. She had used that time without his constant presence to reorganize her mind. Each day that passed without Hamilton around allowed her to focus solely on her work, on Emma's well-being, and on maintaining the facade that protected her from her own decisions. But the calm was always followed by a storm. When Hamilton returned to the mansion, the air seemed to change. It wasn't necessary to see him to feel his presence, because something in the atmosphere of the house became heavier, more oppressive, when he was there. That morning, Ruth saw him enter through the grand mahogany door, his imposing figure, the elegant coat, and the expression of someone who always got what they wanted. As usual, Mary was absent, out for a luncheon with her high society friends. Later, while Ruth was folding sheets in the master bedroom, a soft knock at the door made her freeze. One of the other staff members entered, hesitating slightly, and said, "Mr. Hamilton wants to see you in his office." She knew this moment was coming. Ruth's heart raced, and her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the sheets one last time, trying to buy herself a few more seconds. But there was no escaping it. Walking down the long corridor that led to Hamilton's office, Ruth felt her panic grow with each step. When she reached the dark wooden door, she paused for a second, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in." His voice came from the other side. Ruth opened the door slowly and stepped inside, her posture tense and her gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding Hamilton's eyes. He sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers lightly drumming on the papers in front of him. Seeing her, he made a quick gesture with his hand, signaling for her to close the door. She hesitated for a second, but complied. "Close the door," he repeated, more firmly this time. The sound of the door shutting behind Ruth echoed in the room, muffled only by the pounding of her own heart, which seemed too loud. Hamilton stood up and slowly walked toward her. His eyes scanned her every movement, a mix of power and desire. Without saying a word, he reached out and gently pulled her by the waist. Ruth recoiled at his touch, cold and deliberate. He pulled her closer with unsettling ease. "I thought about you every day while I was away," he murmured into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Every day, Ruth? And now I need to know your answer." His words hit her like a sharp blade. He was asking for her soul, pure and simple. The weight of the question was unbearable. Before she could think of a response, they both heard footsteps in the hallway. Ruth quickly pulled away, almost stumbling over her own feet. Hamilton straightened up, his eyes darting toward the door, and they both noticed the shadow moving outside. The housekeeper, Mrs. Atkins, passed by slowly in the hallway, her eyes discreetly glancing at the partially open door. Hamilton quickly disguised his actions, returning behind his desk as if nothing had happened. Ruth, still trembling inside, knew she had to get out of that situation without raising any suspicion. Mrs. Atkins was sharp, and a small mistake could ruin everything. Thinking fast, Ruth tried to appear calm. "I'll go get some water and coffee for you, Mr. Hamilton," she said, her voice weak but steady enough to sound natural. Hamilton merely nodded, his expression filled with repressed frustration. Ruth hurried out of the room, her hands shaking as she made her way to the kitchen. Once inside the kitchen, Ruth let out a shaky breath. Every move she made was controlled. Every breath felt like an effort. She picked up a tray, poured fresh water, and prepared Hamilton's coffee the way he liked it, all while feeling the weight of Mrs. Atkins' watchful eyes from across the room. Ruth took a deep breath and returned to the office, carrying the tray with as much composure as she could muster, despite the storm raging inside her. When she entered, Mrs. Atkins was still in the hallway, but this time farther away. Ruth couldn't afford to appear shaken. She placed the tray on Hamilton's desk, acting as if nothing had happened. "Here you go, sir." Hamilton, impassive, took the coffee and sipped it, watching her with that same predatory look. "I'm waiting for your answer, Ruth. Don't make me wait too long." Ruth nodded silently and left the office as quickly as she could, feeling his eyes on her until the door closed behind her. The tension from that moment lingered with her for the rest of the day. Every corner of the house seemed darker. Every move Hamilton made more threatening. She felt like prey, being watched and hunted relentlessly. Later that evening, when Ruth arrived home, what she found at her doorstep made her heart stop. A large bouquet of flowers lay on the step, lush, with fresh and vibrant blooms that seemed out of place in her modest surroundings. And beside the bouquet, a thick, sealed envelope. Her hands shook as she picked it up. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. When she tore open the envelope, her suspicions were confirmed, a sum of money larger than she had ever seen in her life. Hamilton was playing hard now. He wasn't going to wait patiently for her answer anymore. Ruth's legs gave way, and she sat on the small chair by the door. The flowers, which should have represented something beautiful, now seemed a symbol of something much more sinister. Each fragrant petal brought a suffocating feeling. The money, instead of freeing her, felt like a golden trap. She knew she was being pulled into something dangerous, something from which there might be no return. Hamilton's promises were becoming more insistent, and the luxury he offered was tempting. But at the same time, a shadow of fear crept into every part of her. What would happen if she said yes? What would happen if she said no? That night, as Emma played with her new doll, and everything seemed, for a moment, normal and peaceful, Ruth felt the weight of her decision looming closer and closer. She was being pulled into an abyss, and she didn't know how to escape. The bouquet and the envelope were just the beginning of something she could no longer control. The fear now wasn't just for Emma's future. It was for her own fate. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, when Ruth finished packing Emma's backpack for school. The coffee was ready, the fresh bread on the table, and for a brief moment, life seemed normal. The bouquet of flowers was still in the corner of the room, with some petals starting to wilt, like a silent reminder of the burden she carried. When Ruth opened the door to leave, the world seemed to stop. There, leaning against a luxurious car with tinted windows, was Hamilton. His impeccable suit contrasted with the modest surroundings of Ruth's life, and his gaze was fixed, piercing, as if he had been studying her for hours. Ruth's heart immediately raced, her body paralyzed by a mix of fear and surprise. She hadn't expected him, could never have imagined he would come to her home. What was he doing there? For a brief moment, she glanced around, making sure Emma was still inside. And what if the neighbors saw? "Ruth," Hamilton called, his voice low and rough, but with a tone that left no room for refusal. He motioned with his hand for her to approach the car. "Come, get in." She hesitated, panic rising in her chest. This was going too far. It wasn't just a game of looks in the mansion anymore. He was here, in her life, in her personal space. But before she could react, Hamilton walked around the car and opened the passenger door for her. "Get in, Ruth," he repeated, this time with a softness that made her feel even more trapped. Ruth, not knowing how to refuse, obeyed, slowly getting into the car. As soon as the door closed, the smell of new leather and the oppressive atmosphere of the vehicle enveloped her. Her eyes were fixed on her hands, now trembling in her lap. She tried to speak, but before any words came out, Hamilton surprised her. Without warning, he leaned in and kissed her. The touch of his lips was insistent, too quick for her to process, and Ruth froze. Her mind spun. What was happening? The kiss seemed to steal her breath, and not in a good way. It was as if the air inside that car had disappeared. Every thought fragmented as Hamilton pressed further. When he finally pulled away, a slight smile of satisfaction on his face, Ruth was left speechless. This was not the man she had known from a distance, the polite and calculating millionaire. This was another version, one she had never seen before. Hamilton looked at her, as if he were certain he already possessed her, as if her mere presence there meant her surrender. "I want you, Ruth," he said, his voice low and controlled, but filled with overflowing desire. "I've thought about it for days. I want you all to myself." Ruth, still in shock, felt a wave of conflicting emotions flood her. It was as if the kiss had pulled the ground out from under her feet. But when he placed his hand on the steering wheel, ready to drive off, something inside her screamed for control. She couldn't just let this happen. Stop! Her voice came out louder than she expected, filled with urgency. Stop the car. Hamilton, surprised by her reaction, looked at her for a moment, the engine softly rumbling, ready to leave. He frowned, not understanding. Ruth, what are you doing? I'm trying to. I need more time, she interrupted, her eyes shining with confusion and desperation. I can't just do this. I can't keep working at your house and have an affair with you. This isn't right. She knew her words were true, but there was a deeper layer he didn't see. She wasn't just battling the moral dilemma of being involved with a married man. She was fighting against her own fate, trying to hold on to what was left of her dignity, her sanity. Hamilton sighed, frustrated, but finally took his hand off the wheel and stopped the car at the curb. You're overthinking this, Ruth. It's simple. I told you. You don't need to worry about anything. I'll take care of everything. I know you said that, but I just can't, she insisted, tears threatening to appear in the corners of her eyes. I need to go to work today, and I'm going to quit. I can't keep working there while this is happening. She saw the look of surprise on Hamilton's face. Quit? That clearly wasn't part of his plan. But before he could say anything, Ruth continued. I'm going to quit. It'll be easier that way. I won't feel guilty all the time. Hamilton, for a moment, seemed confused. He slowly nodded, but something in his eyes indicated that he wasn't convinced. Ruth felt the weight of her words, and how they hung between them like an invisible barrier. She couldn't stay in that suffocating environment, surrounded by temptation and guilt. She couldn't give in to the darkness that Hamilton carried with him. Hamilton touched her face with his fingers, in a gesture meant to be tender, but that made her shiver. I'll wait, Ruth. I'll give you the time you need, but remember what I offered you. A different life. An easier one. No worries. Ruth said nothing. She just nodded, a lump in her throat, as she felt the car slow down and stop completely. Without another word, she got out of the car, closing the door gently, but with the weight of the world on her shoulders. As she walked back toward her house, Ruth's heart pounded so fast that she could barely hear her own thoughts. She had told Hamilton she would quit, but he didn't know what that truly meant for her. She thought about the money she had received along with the flowers and felt a little less guilty. When she reached her home, the sound of the door locking behind her was a temporary relief. The bouquet of flowers was still in the same place, like a reminder of the promise he had made. She needed to make a decision soon, and fast. Emma's future, Ruth's own survival, and her sanity depended on her next move. And now, the game was becoming more dangerous. Ruth could feel that she was on the brink of changing her life forever. And Hamilton, he was waiting for an answer. The soft wind rustled the leaves along the path leading to the Lockwood mansion as Ruth walked slowly, her heart heavy with the decision she had made the night before. The conversation with Hamilton in the car still echoed in her mind, but she knew that, for her own protection and for her daughter's sake, she had to distance herself. Each step toward the mansion tightened the knot in her stomach. Quitting her job wouldn't be easy, but it was the only possible way forward. When she entered through the kitchen door, the familiar aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air. The place that had become almost like a second home to her now felt distant and foreign. Mrs. Atkins, the housekeeper, had her back turned as she organized some plates on the counter. Ruth took a deep breath, knowing it was time to talk. Good morning, Mrs. Atkins, Ruth began, her voice firm, though tinged with nervousness. The housekeeper turned around, and seeing the expression on Ruth's face, her brow furrowed slightly. Good morning, Ruth. You seem worried. What's going on? Ruth hesitated for a moment, her hands nervously twisting together. Mrs. Atkins had always been a strict but fair figure during her time working there. While they weren't emotionally close, Ruth knew this woman represented the stability of the house. I need to speak with you, Ruth started, the weight of the words almost suffocating her. I have to resign. Mrs. Atkins, who had been about to pour tea, froze. Her sharp eyes fixed on Ruth, showing surprise but also a calculated expression, as if she already sensed that something wasn't right. Resign? She asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Why, Ruth? You've been here for months. You know the routine, and everyone likes you. What's going on? Ruth's heart tightened even more. She had already planned her response, but now, standing in front of Mrs. Atkins, the guilt and weight of the truth threatened to crush her. My parents need help, back in the town where I grew up. My daughter misses them too. I have to go back. I can't stay here. Mrs. Atkins sighed deeply, like someone who knew there was more to the story but chose not to press. You know you don't have to leave right now, don't you? We can arrange things so that you stay a few more days. At least until we find someone to replace you. I can't. I need to leave as soon as possible, Ruth insisted, barely holding back the tears. I'm so sorry. Before the conversation could continue, the sound of light footsteps echoed in the kitchen, and they both turned at the same time. It was Mary, walking in with her usual serenity, her kind eyes fixed on the two women. She looked curious about what was happening, her peaceful smile quickly fading into a look of uncertainty. Good morning, Ruth. Mrs. Atkins, Mary said, her soft voice cutting through the silence. What's going on? Is everything all right? Mrs. Atkins looked at Ruth, giving her the opportunity to explain, but she ended up speaking first. Ruth is resigning, ma'am. She says she needs to return to her parents' town. It seems they need her help. Mary's eyes widened in surprise. Resigning? Oh, Ruth, why? Is something wrong here? If it's a salary issue, we can talk about it. I'm sure we can arrange a raise. Ruth, her heart clenching even tighter, shook her head quickly. No, ma'am. It's not that. The salary is more than fair. You've always been very good to me. It's just my family. My parents need me, and my daughter misses them, and I can't ignore that. Mary observed Ruth with a look of deep concern and sadness. It was clear that, over the months, she had grown attached to Ruth, trusting her in ways she hadn't even realized. I understand, but we'll be very sad to see you go. You know you're an important part of this house. Mary took a step closer to Ruth and gently touched her arm, a genuine gesture of affection. Are you sure there's nothing we can do to make you stay? At least for a little while longer. Ruth lowered her eyes, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She knew that Mary didn't deserve this, didn't deserve to be deceived the way she had been. But there was no other way out. I wish I could stay, ma'am, but I really need to go. Mary sighed, accepting it, though with great sadness. Wait here for a moment, Ruth, she said, her voice still sweet and understanding. I'll get a few things for you and your daughter. She quickly left the kitchen, leaving Ruth and Mrs. Atkins in a tense silence. Ruth knew this wouldn't be a simple goodbye. There was much more behind her leaving than either Mrs. Atkins or Mary would ever know. When Mary returned, she carried a few bags of clothes and a small envelope. She smiled, trying to appear cheerful, but Ruth could see the sadness in her eyes. Here are some clothes for Emma and for you. I know traveling and starting somewhere new can be hard, so I hope this helps. She also handed over the envelope, and Ruth knew it contained money. Consider this a little help. And please, if you ever come back to the city, find us. You'll always be welcome here. Ruth felt a lump in her throat. Mary was kind, a woman who had always treated her with dignity and respect. Looking at the donations, at Mary's genuine kindness, the guilt burned deep in Ruth's chest. How had she allowed herself to get involved in something so dirty with Hamilton? I don't know how to thank you, ma'am, Ruth managed to murmur, her voice trembling slightly. You've been wonderful to me. I'll never forget what you've done for me and Emma. Mary smiled sadly, her eyes shimmering with compassion. You've done a lot for us too, Ruth. I hope your family is well, and that you find peace. Take care of yourself, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find us. Ruth simply nodded, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. When she finally walked out the door, the cold morning air wrapped around her, a breeze that seemed to cut straight through her soul. She was saying goodbye to a life that could have been good, but was poisoned by secrets. As she walked home, the feeling of guilt seemed to grow with every step. She had left that mansion with more than her own choices. She carried a weight that Mary would never know, the weight of a betrayal she hadn't planned, but from which she couldn't escape. Later that evening, Mary mentioned Ruth's resignation to Hamilton. They sat in the living room, the soft crackle of the fireplace filling the space between them. She said she needs to return to her parents' town, Mary explained, her voice touched with melancholy. I offered her help, but she seemed so determined. Hamilton, reclining in his chair with a glass of whiskey in hand, simply nodded as if the news were insignificant. It's a shame, he muttered, without emotion. She was a good worker. Mary looked at him, slightly surprised by his indifference, but it wasn't unusual. Yes, she was, she said softly. I hope she'll be okay. As the silence fell between them, Hamilton took a long sip of his whiskey, his mind elsewhere, already calculating his next move with Ruth. He had made up his mind. The next day, everything would be different. He had a plan. He would find her and spend a few days with her, far from the mansion, in a hotel he had already reserved. They would have time alone, without interruptions, and he would finally have Ruth for himself. The desire to possess her and control the situation burned in his mind like an unquenchable flame. The whiskey glass shimmered in the light of the fire as he savored the last drop, already imagining the days ahead. He turned to Mary, who was sitting on the nearby sofa, reading a book, completely unaware of the dark thoughts brewing in her husband's mind. I'm traveling tomorrow, Hamilton said casually, though with a hint of anticipation in his voice. I need to take care of some business out of town. I'll be back in a few days. Mary looked up from her book, offering a brief smile. I hope everything goes well, she replied, not suspecting the real reason for his trip. Have a good trip? Hamilton nodded, revealing nothing of what he was truly planning. The next day would bring the fulfillment of his desires. Meanwhile, Ruth walked home slowly, the cold breeze touching her skin, but the real chill was inside her, woven into the memories of what had happened over the past few days. When she entered her small apartment, her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to her knees on the living room floor, unable to hold back the torrent of tears. She cried. She cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. Every tear seemed to carry the weight of her choices, the lies she had to tell, and the guilt that had been piling up in her chest. The kiss in the car, that moment haunted her, replaying in her mind like a constant nightmare. And then there was Mary, her kindness, her generosity, the gifts of clothes and money that Ruth had accepted with a forced smile, knowing that she was deceiving the one person who had truly treated her with respect. How did I let this happen? She whispered between sobs. What have I done? She struggled to her feet and walked into Emma's room, where her daughter played quietly with the doll Ruth had recently bought for her. Seeing her there, so innocent and unaware of the chaos unfolding around her, Ruth's heart broke all over again. She knew that the only reason she had endured all of this was for Emma. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. She couldn't live under the shadow of fear, of Hamilton's controlling desire, and the weight of betrayal. She couldn't keep lying to herself. And so, she made her decision. The next morning, Hamilton woke up early, eager to pick up Ruth and start the days he had been longing for. He dressed quickly, his heart racing with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. He was in control. He was a powerful man, used to getting everything he wanted, and Ruth would be his, no matter what it took. When he arrived at the street where Ruth lived, Hamilton stepped out of the car, anxious, and without thinking, went straight to the door. He knocked. He waited, but there was no answer. And then he noticed something that left him disoriented. There were no signs of life in Ruth's small apartment. The curtains were drawn, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. He frowned, discomfort creeping in. An elderly woman, Ruth's neighbor, sat on the porch of the house next door. Impatient, Hamilton called to her. The woman who lives here, Ruth? Where is she? The neighbor looked at him, surprised by the question, but soon answered. She's gone. She arrived yesterday, packed her bags, and left with her daughter. She said she was going back to her parents' town. She didn't mention where she was going. For a moment, Hamilton was frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. Ruth was gone? Without warning? Without leaving a trace? What did that mean? Blood rushed to his head, and he felt fury boiling inside his chest. How dare she do this to him? How dare she escape the fate he had mapped out for the two of them? Without saying another word to the neighbor, Hamilton got back into his car and sped away. His thoughts were a chaotic storm, and all he could feel was a mixture of rage and defeat. Ruth had betrayed him, and now she was beyond his reach. When he arrived home, earlier than Mary expected, she saw him walk through the door with a dark, closed expression. "You're back so soon," she said, surprised. "What happened to your trip?" Hamilton just shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "The trip was canceled," he muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "Nothing important." Mary, sensing the harsh tone in his voice, didn't ask any more questions. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Hamilton seemed furious, as if something had slipped through his fingers, but she chose not to push. Meanwhile, miles away, Ruth had settled into a new town, the same one she had left years before. A sense of relief washed over her as she watched Emma play in the small park next to their new apartment. The money she had received from Hamilton and Mary had allowed her to start a new life, far from the chaos that had imprisoned her. Ruth found a stable job, something she never imagined in her previous situation. It was dignified work, in a place where she felt respected, and slowly, she began to regain her independence. Most importantly, she reconnected with Emma's father, a man who, despite his past mistakes, now seemed willing to be present. With him, Ruth finally found a sense of stability and support that had long been missing. Together, they were trying to build a new life, filled with hope and renewal. As she watched Emma smile, running through the park with other children, Ruth felt a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of guilt had finally lifted. She had made the right decision. She had escaped not only Hamilton, but the dark future he had planned for her. Now, she could move forward free. The sun shone brightly in the sky, and for the first time in a long while, Ruth allowed herself to believe that the future would be different. It would be better. She was at peace. Did you enjoy the story? What do you think of Ruth's decision? Comment below and let me know if you would have made the same choice or done something different. And don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Your support means a lot.